Good evening. My name is Kyle Semmel, and I'm the Communications Manager of the Western New York Land Conservancy. Thank you all for coming tonight, including all of you watching via live stream. Before I introduce Tony, I want to thank our sponsors for making tonight's event possible. Renee Bush, the Bank of East Aurora, a wedding venue and boutique hotel, the Biology and Environmental Science programs at Canisius College, and in particular, Associate Professor of Biology, Dr. Katie Costanzo, who is also one of our Land Conservancy's many great board members. If you are a board member of the Land Conservancy, please stand up real quick. If you're here. Thank you. We have a very fine board. I'd also like to thank the Chautauqua Institution, in particular, Mark Wensler, the Director of the Climate Change Initiative, Mark P. and Deborah E. Kisker, the Nature Sanctuary Society of Western New York, and Talking Leaves Books, who is stationed in the back selling, of course, Tony's books. Following the event, Tony will be happy to sign your copy. And if you are viewing this event from home, I encourage you to order your copy through Talking Leaves. They are a longtime independent supporter of books and literature here in Buffalo. Here in Western New York, we are blessed with a vast amount of fresh water and forests that teem with incredible wildlife. With developmental pressure all around us, this is not something we can afford to take for granted. The Land Conservancy recognizes that the very ground upon which we stand today is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Seneca, Tonawanda Seneca, and Tuscarora nations and other indigenous communities. We are thankful to the Haudenosaunee who have been and continue to be the stewards of this land. Our community is committed to the Haudenosaunee 7th generation principle, which asks us to honor the lessons of the last 7 generations as we work in partnership to shape and heal the world the next 7 generations will inherit. It is for this very reason that we invited Tony Hist to Buffalo to speak. Tony's most recent book, Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth, is part history of science, part landscape scale conservation, part biography of the heroes, men and women and scientists and politicians and indigenous peoples who are leading the way. And it is part all of these things, but it is wholly inspiring. Through the Land Conservancy's Western New York Wildway Initiative, including this year's major project, the Floating Fen in Chautauqua County, our work advances Tony's vision of preserving 50% of our lands by 2050. But it's more than a vision. It's a call to arms presented with eloquence and clarity. It's also a way for all of us, for you and me, to truly and positively shape the world for these next generations. In the months since I asked Tony to come speak to this community, he's become absorbed in all things Western New York, peppering me or my colleague Marisa Ricci with questions on a weekly and sometimes daily basis. Tony has an unquenchable curiosity. It has been a pleasure getting to know him, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome him to the stage tonight. Ready to go.
Okay. Thank you, Kyle. It's an honor to be here, and I apologize for pestering the staff of the Conservancy, but there's so much to learn. This book, I think I got started on it partly because I was moved by the plight of the animals. It's what we used, the biodiversity crisis, so-called, is what we used to call the other environmental crisis, but we now realize that it's all one crisis. And we also realize that in addition to being an urgent situation, it's one with a solution. And the third point, which is even more important to me, is that there are already so many people working hard to bring that solution into reality. This was the last male northern white rhino, Sudan, died about 5 years ago, I think it was, with his devoted, beloved keeper by his side. They said he had the personality of a golden retriever, an adorable little animal. Some of these losses get in the news. This was Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island giant tortoise in the Galapagos. He died, what was it, about 10, 12 years ago, at the age of 100 or 101. Solitario Jorge, they called him. These kinds of losses have forced us to coin a new word, a sad new word, endling, meaning the very last of its kind. So one of the tasks now is to bring an end to endlings. The urgency of the situation has been underscored by a number of scientific findings. One of them, that 1 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction in the near term. Another being announced just a month or two ago, that the decisions we make now and in the next decade or so will affect what life is like thousands of years from now. That puts us in a pretty important spot. So if we were just, as Kyle just reminded us, we've learned to respect the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, which talks about thinking 7 generations back and forwards. But if we have to think, say, 3,000 years ahead, that's a different kind of situation. That's more than 120 generations ahead. That's a stretch even for us. And it would also mean something like 150 generations of elephants and maybe 750 generations of giraffes. Sobering, but something we can do something about. 150 years ago, this was perhaps the most famous painting in the US. It was widely distributed, prints of it. It's called American Progress. And that is American Progress. Columbia, the young lady in the center of the picture, was considered the female equivalent of Uncle Sam. And she is drifting across, floating across the country slowly, almost at the speed of a Thanksgiving Day parade balloon. She's, of course, white, and she's, of course, golden-haired. And behind her is stretching telegraph wire and railroads, and retreating in front of her sullenly are Native Americans and bison and a snarling bear into the darkness. The odd thing is as we look back on it, of this view of progress, it's not so much that what was being brought was bad, it's that we figured we had to scrape things clean and subtract what had always been there before we could add something of value. We had to get rid of things first. We had to begin any plus with a minus. Well, even though this point of view gripped so much of the country at that time, it was only a year later that this happened. That's a picture of Yellowstone, the first national park. In 1872 or 3, we suddenly realized there were places that were so important to us and so special, they had to stay the way they had always been, despite progress. Okay, so 150 years ago, and this is sometimes national parks are sometimes called the greatest idea Americans ever had. Certainly one of the greatest, maybe it leaves out jazz. And I just read an article the other day that said, butterflies evolved in North America. So that's another North American invention, something we have to think carefully about. But if it took us if we got started on this protection 150 years ago, and now we've protected about 15% of the country, and that's true pretty much of the world, 15%, 150 years to get from nothing to 15%. Suddenly we've got this new language that is bombarding us, talks about half Earth, 50 by 50, 30 by 30, the whole idea of protecting 30% of the land and water by the year 2030. Okay, so 150 years to go from 0 to 15, less than a decade to go from 15 to 30. Talk about a challenge. But it wasn't just that this idea of national parks suddenly emerged. Something else was in the works that is of great value and importance to New York State. And it began in the Lake District of England at the beginning of the 19th century, when the great poet William Wordsworth wrote a guide to the lake country. That's the lake country as seen from his study window. Beautiful lake country. And he said, the Lake District is a sort of national property in which every man has a right and interest who has an eye to perceive and a heart to enjoy. So who owned it wasn't as important as the fact that it was part of everyone's heritage, whether they lived there or not, whether they owned land in the property or not. And as a result of that, here in New York, we came up with another way of creating great parks, the so-called Blue Line Park, which came into being in the Adirondacks in 1892. The idea being that if you know a place is special, you can define it as being special, and you draw an imaginary blue line around it and determine that as you change it, that specialness will stay part of it. But you don't have to own it all. Adirondack Park, 6 million acres, as you can see, it's so big it swallows up all those national parks. Looks like one of those biology textbook examples of a single cell with a nucleus and a mitochondria. But only half of it, or less than half of it, is public property. The rest is private property, but it all works in harmony. So we invented the Blue Line Park. Then we sort of forgot about this invention, although the English made their national park system a whole series of Blue Line parks. So we did good in ways we weren't even conscious of. And yet a third force entered just at the beginning of the 20th century. A young college graduate named Benton Mackay, a rugged New Englander, celebrated his commencement by taking a pal and bushwhacking their way up Stratton Mountain, one of the Green Mountains in the Appalachians of Vermont. No trails in those days. Shinning up the tallest trees they could find, swayed at the top, and suddenly, as he remembered more than 60 years later, Mackay had this sense of what he later called a planetary feeling, that he was not just on one tree, but he was in a single place that stretched along the length of the peaks of the Appalachians from Maine all the way down to Georgia. Here was yet another way of absorbing the countryside and thinking about its future. Well, 20 years later, he wrote an essay, and that was the beginning of the Appalachian Trail. And it so grabbed people's imagination that over the next 12 years, almost entirely working by volunteers on their weekends, people carved a hiking trail along the lengths of the peaks of the Appalachians. It's said to be the largest public works ever undertaken voluntarily by volunteers. Pretty extraordinary, just because people all were responding to this same feeling that had overcome a college graduate 20 years before. We're very lucky here in North America as a continent because we sort of got good bones, so to speak. We not only have running north to south on the East Coast, the Appalachian Mountains that so gripped Mackay, as you can see on the right-hand side of the picture. We've got parallel to that, the Rockies running down the west side. The Rockies had their own Benton Mackay in the 1990s, a young, very young Canadian environmentalist and lawyer, Harvey, came along and had the same feeling that he was camping in the Canadian Rockies, but he felt like he was in a single place that stretched north from Yellowstone all the way to the top of the Yukon. And that became known as Yellowstone to Yukon. And as an organizing principle, it too has protected about 20% of that land since the early 1990s. And now, of course, people have extended the vision southward from Yellowstone as well, down into the Sierra Madre forests of Mexico. So we like to think of ourselves here in Western New York as part of the Great Lakes. We have to think of ourselves, but look at that picture of how up at the top of the continent, we've got this most extraordinary landscape that many of us not even sure it's still there. The boreal forest of Alaska and Canada. It's 3,700 miles long, west to east. It's 1,000 miles north to south. It's probably the largest and most intact landscape left on the planet because the same forest in Russia is getting chopped down. We know what's been happening in the Amazon. But as I was just saying, okay, we think of ourselves here as part of the Great Lakes, and we are, but look what a provincial attitude even sophisticated US people have about the Great Lakes, because it doesn't stop at Superior and Huron. There's this whole chain of lakes that stretches up northwest through Canada. Great Bear Lake at the end of the chain, part of which is north of the Arctic Circle, bigger than Lake Erie, and absolutely so clear still that you can look down 60 feet to the bottom of the lake and see what look like giant logs resting on the bottom, but no, they're not. They're giant lake trout, 60 to 70 pounds, 60 to 70 years old, flourishing there. We were told 100 years ago that the frontier had disappeared, but that's because we were thinking linearly, east to west. If Frederick Jackson Turner had made a right turn and headed north, he would have realized that this extraordinary landscape is still very much with us today. And not only that, but because this landscape is intact and because the Canadians, even though they treated their own native population as almost as badly as we did, never evicted them from the landscape. They're still there with their knowledge. And now the Canadians are turning to them and saying, please help us set up an entire second national park system that you will administer. You will be the moccasins and mucklucks on the ground, as they say. You will be the stewards and the rangers. And that's going to help Canada reach its goal of achieving 30% protection by the year 2030. The original national parks vision stumbled a bit. And in the 1980s, we realized that although these parks were of enormous value, they weren't working that well as protectors of species. They were leaking species because no one had told the animals where the borders were. And if they wandered out, if there was development on the edges of the park, they couldn't get back in. So suddenly this young graduate student, Bill Newmark, made his name by writing this eye-opening papers showing how many species were being lost from even the greatest of the great parks we'd set aside. So here was the beginning of a problem. And it led to this whole new scientific discovery by conservation biologists that we probably need to protect something like half of the landscape in order to keep all the plants and animals with us. It's a rough figure. Some species need more than 50%, some less, but it sort of strikes a balance. And it's led, as they've also discovered, to a kind of half-Earth math. If we only save 15% of land, and as the figure we're now at, we're going to wind up all too soon with only about 25% of all the species that exist now. But if we just bump it up to 50%, we can save at least 85 to 90% of all the species. Not everything, but close to everything. And I think that's such an important point. I want to underscore it by repeating it. If we go to 50%, we can go to 90%. That's the promise. And of course, now we're realizing that there are so many more reasons to want the rest of life still to be around us. Because we depend, it's selfish. We depend on these patterns of living beings to produce the food we need, to keep the water clean enough to drink, even to provide enough oxygen in the air for every second or third breath. And we're realizing how much the plants that we've got with us are doing to store carbon and keep climate change from getting even worse. And we're realizing the extent to which our own dependence on nature for our physical and mental well-being is of such importance. The whole Japanese concept of forest bathing, Shinrin Yoku, as a restorative. Lois and I had a chance just today to go with some Western New York Land Conservancy people to one of their preserves, just 10 or 12 miles from here, Mossy Point. What an extraordinary hour we spent up there, seeing hemlock trees 450 years old, amazing towering things, being greeted by a great horned owl which flew across our path in the middle of the day. We felt blessed. And that's part of what is underway here in Western New York, the marvelous landscape that you have. Please look for a moment into the steely gaze of Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, a scientist who is, interestingly, equally revered in Russia and Ukraine. He was the head of the first Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences, but in Russia, subway stations are named for him. The Russians named a crater on the dark side of the moon after him. And he was the person who helped us begin to focus on this whole band of life that surrounds the planet, the biosphere, the zone of living that, as far as we know, is unique anywhere in the universe. In the 1920s, he wrote a book, Biosfera, the first biography of the biosphere, and pointed out that life goes back so close to the beginning of the planet. It's astonishing. So life as a force is billions of years old. We know it's been so resilient ever since and abundant, but it has this third dimension, or this almost absence of a third dimension. Most species that we know of live between the top of Mount Everest and the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. It's only about 12.5-mile vertical distance. Laid out horizontally, as someone has pointed out, you could easily drive across it in 20 minutes or less. So in addition to our ancientness and our abundance, we have built in, we're just beginning to acknowledge to ourselves, this vulnerability. Everything we do is within this little band of life. It's hard even to get a picture of it because it extends under our feet up into the sky. But that's one of the tasks of one, is learning to respect with and honor that thinness. In addition to which, we're discovering so much about the nature of the life around us that we never really realized. That elephants are not only caring, but empathetic. That octopuses can recognize human faces. That spiders can dream. And just last summer, a German zoologist wrote very complicated book in which he said that bees, which have brains that are no bigger than a poppy seed, have rich inner lives. So we are surrounded by this sea of awareness. It isn't just us, this sea of sentience. What are the consequences of that? Well, there's two. One is that every acre counts. And the second is there really is no such thing as empty land or a vacant lot. It may not have human uses, but it is full of life. And it is up to us, if we want to add human uses, not to subtract it, but to work with it. A new way of defining American progress. Well, it turns out in this whole half-earth science, there are three basic R's. Retain what's still wild, restore things that were once wilder, and reconnect the big places so that the animals and plants do have ways of moving around. A generation ago, a brilliant blind American architect named Ron Mace invented what we now call universal design. The idea being that we shouldn't build anything for our use that doesn't welcome people of every kind of physical ability and mental ability. It's why we, as a result, have the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's why there are ramps in front of this beautiful center here at Canisius College. But it's also, the interiors have changed as a result of universal design. The idea that plugs for lamps have to be at wheelchair height, not just way down at our ankles. All kinds of things, playgrounds that can be reconfigured so that children of all abilities can play together. Okay, so the next step beyond that, I would say, is all species design. If we're going to impose our needs on a piece of empty land, let's work with the life forms that are already there. So that's the challenge. All species design, a plus without a minus, a new place without displacing what's already been there before. Well, that leads to all kinds of different ways of looking at things. It's only in the last generation that we realized surgery could be performed in a way that doesn't have to just slice people open and leave a scar. We can instead insert three tiny tubes, one with lights, miniaturized lights, and two with miniaturized surgical snippers. And now laparoscopic surgery is the preferred way to do appendectomies and all kinds of operations. We could never get beyond that wall before. Well, can we reinvent mining on the same terms instead of leaving huge scars on the land? I don't know if we can, but I found something on the internet that says they're already doing it. One company that can extract minerals with a minimal presence on the face of the land. Remember Bill Newmark? That was the young graduate student who discovered that the national parks were leaking species way back in 1987. Well, he's not quite as young anymore, but he's a distinguished professor out west. And he's now come up with a part of a solution, which is if some of the great parks can be kept connected through corridors, then they too can retain species. And he just wrote a paper showing how if you connected up, say, Yellowstone to Glacier Park, you could retard the diminution of species there by hundreds of generations. I find I'm learning so much since my book came out. Just talking to Bill Mark last month was something I hadn't heard about. Similarly, these terms 30 by 30, 50 by 50, half Earth are just beginning to impinge on our lives. One of the reasons being that last December, 188 nations met in Canada, in Montreal, and voted that this was now a new global goal, 30 by 30. The Biden administration, on a separate basis, also has adopted 30 by 30 as a US goal. Okay, well, this meeting was supposed to have taken place in 2020, but then COVID came along. So now the challenge is to protect 30% in what is by now 2023, the shortest decade around. We 7.5 years to do this work that sounded like it was too much to get done in 10 years. Well, if we cheat, we could say we got 8 years if we go to the end of 2030, to December 31st instead of January 1st. But still, what a challenge. Well, now 2 states have risen to the occasion. California is the first state to have set up a statewide 30 by 30 program. Just last year, they protected another 631,000 acres. They say they're on track to get to 30 by 30. New York State, not surprisingly, is the second state to have adopted 30 by 30 as a goal. And I've found just a couple of weeks ago, we were invited up to a town in the north of Westchester County, north of New York City, the affluent suburbs, where they too have set up 30 by 30 as a goal. And by protecting a large chunk of undeveloped land in the middle of that town, and that small town, 20,000 acres or so, they now have reached the point where this is this beautiful preserve that they protected that connected up a lot of previously protected land. It's allowed them to retain the animals that have been there, and including the wood turtle seen on the right. Wood turtle is a wonderful animal, increasingly rare. It has the ability to do what is called the stomp. It just stamps its 2 front feet on the ground, and somehow that is a signal to worms to come to the surface. They think it's rain, and then the turtle eats the worm. Brilliant. So 332 to go for Somers, New York, this town in northeast Westchester County, to get to 30 by 30. Well, not every place can get to 30 by 30, but it can inspire a lot of good thinking. So, of course, I'm leading up to another place I'm only just beginning to explore as a biodiversity standout, and that's Western New York, and a place that it seems to me has a long history of being a place where brilliant ideas come to explode and get even more brilliant. Frederick Law Olmsted built Central Park in the 1850s in New York. Suddenly, this wonderful idea of a huge park in the middle of a city, that a city could have a huge park, became a galvanizing idea. In 1868, he was brought to Buffalo, and was because he was told Buffalo needs a Central Park. And right around the corner, he was shown one site, and he said, and it's shown 2 other sites, and he said, no, you need all 3 places as parks. We don't want to just put a park in a city. We want to put a city in a park, connected up by parkways, extensions of parks, which will function like the landscape corridors, keeping people feeling like they're part of the park wherever they are. Then he went to Niagara Falls, realized that Niagara Falls was being surrounded by stuff that had no interest in the magnificence of that astounding piece of nature. Started the Free Niagara movement, got all kinds of, probably the first big public relations campaign for a landscape in the country, got a lot of big shots to sign this petition, and New York finally acknowledged this and set up the Niagara Reservation on the U.S. banks of the falls. It's been said, I think it was someone here in Buffalo said the other day, that the reason people say that you get the best view of the falls from the Canadian side is because the U.S. protected the American side, so you have something nice to look at. And this became the very first state park anywhere in the world. So here's this amazing tradition that you have. Down in the city of New York, we feel jealous of you. And let's not call it an unfair advantage that you have, but certainly what a head start you have on the rest of us. Now we know that there have been stumblings along the way. We were just driving into town on what was once the Humboldt Parkway of Olmsted and is now this odd Kensington Expressway. There are great plans to do something about rebridging the Kensington Expressway, rebuilding the neighborhood it destroyed. Work in progress. But as a place where great things come to get greater, that's one of the things that drew me to want to speak to people at the Western New York Land Conservancy. Now, here it seems to me is an extraordinary example of this. This conservancy, as a land trust, is just over 30 years old. It's done great stuff. It's picked some very special places to protect. Something like 8,000 acres under its belt with 4,000 acres of projects in the work. And each project they take on is a very special place. The river line, the project here in the city, as a High Line railroad into Park for Buffalo, connecting up some areas in parts of the city that haven't done quite so well, is an extraordinarily designed project. Then down in the south, you're already working to protect the floating fen, this extraordinary bog that has carnivorous plants like sundews. It has fields of blue iris. It has high bush blueberries. It has holly. It's another extraordinary landscape. Okay, so any group would be satisfied with a record like that. 12,000 acres of protection. Not the Western New York Land Conservancy. Suddenly you've got this whole new project of protecting maybe 1,100,000 acres, the Western New York Wildway. I need a good analogy here. How does one thing start at one size and suddenly become something extraordinarily larger? Is it that an era that needed the power of waterfalls like the Letchworth Park waterfalls now realizes it needs the power of something Niagara-sized? Is it a case of turbocharging an effort? And I can't tell you what turbocharging is. I know it means adding more air somehow to the engine and as a way of bringing more fuel to the engine, but I know what the effect is. Here's this plan for the New York Wildway. This area is huge. Western New York, the 8 counties of Western New York, is bigger than the state of Connecticut. But think what it would be like if 28% of it were protected and not 5 or 6% as the case is now. This is a chance to do something extraordinary, not only for Western New York and not only for the biodiversity of Western New York. And by the way, if California is the most biodiverse state in the Union, New York is probably the second most biodiverse state in the Union because we're at this dividing line between as an area which has sort of the southernmost extension of a lot of northern species and the northernmost extension of a lot of southern species, all here in one place. If we put together cores of intact landscapes and then connect them up again, you've got this huge network that doesn't exclude people, but does retain plants and animals. What an ambitious project. What a wonderful idea. Down in the south part of this Western New York, you have one of the great landscapes of the country. A treasure of a landscape waiting only to be treasured. The seeds were planted over a century ago. Nathan Miller, governor of New York in the early 1920s, I'm told he was the last upstate guy to be elected governor before Governor Hochul. Came up with the notion of Allegheny State Park, 65,000 acres. The governor at the end of the 1920s, Franklin Roosevelt, came up with the idea of buying up land for state forests outside the Adirondacks or the Catskills. And that landscape is now peppered with these public acquisitions. So you've got the nucleus of a nucleus already. You've got extraordinary animals that are still there. You've got the possibility of reconnecting up to animals that weren't once there. But at this point, only 19% of the wildway is protected. So, okay. Are there difficulties to overcome? Yes, it's true that people who live a mile from each other spell Allegheny differently. And I'm told one is supposed to be derived from the French word and one from the English word. Maybe we can get beyond this kind of problem. And of course, there are serious problems too. This, like Olmsted's Parks, is a land of pain and persistence. Terrible things were done to the Seneca Indians. A treaty that George Washington wanted to be made in 1794, one of the first treaties independent US made with the Seneca Indians, guaranteed them land in the west of New York State in perpetuity. And in the 1960s, 10,000 of those acres were flooded by the Kinswood Dam as a way of not flooding Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But 10,000 acres in New York State were flooded. 600 homes had to be abandoned and flooded out. And there are a lot of rural potential environmental justice areas within the Wildway. So there's a lot of work to be done. But it isn't just on behalf of Western New York that you're undertaking this, or even on behalf of the state of New York. Here's Benton MacKay's successors, group called the Wildlands Network, which have imposed a half-Earth vision on the whole eastern seaboard, an update of Mackay's idea that it wasn't just the peaks that were important, but the land around the peaks, what he called the Appalachian realm. Well, here's something even bigger. And what it does locally is it includes the Allegheny Plateau as important as the actual chain of the Appalachians themselves. So that if not only the Western New York, southern part of Western New York can be a core, it's on top, sitting on top of this great belt of wildland in north central Pennsylvania, anchored by the Allegheny National Forest, a place that has old growth, a place that has some skies that are so brilliant at night still they can be considered a dark sky preserve. It has designated wilderness areas. That huge chunk of land could be connected straight up to the Adirondacks. And you would then have not only protection along the peaks, but you'd have protection along the plateau, a belt and suspenders approach, doubling the chance of keeping everything alive. And you've got some neighbors who would like to be partners with you. In New England, there's this group called the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities. It speaks for all the 6 states of New England. And they are about to issue just next week a brand new report saying, we've protected 25% of New England. New England is what, maybe 40 million acres to New York State's 35. But we haven't done a good job of the way you have of protecting wildland at all. We've got to get started on that. And let's all work together. Finally, they're adopting as a watchword, wildlands are indispensable. So here's all this going on, and maybe it's time to think about that blue line idea again. Maybe in the 1970s, people in the National Park Service thought they could invent a second national park system based on blue line parks all over the country, and they drew up a preliminary map map of what they would look like. Well, it was going to be the great parks initiative of the second Jimmy Carter administration. And of course, there was no second Jimmy Carter administration. He got trounced by Ronald Reagan in 1980. But that's receded now. Maybe we can revisit the idea. Thanks to stunning initiatives like the Western New York Wildway. People always ask me, how would I get involved, even if what you say is true and feasible? And I spent, one of the wonderful things about writing my book was finding people all around the North American continent who are responding to this challenge and just coming up with amazing ways of protecting land that no one had ever heard of before. But among bird watchers, there's this phrase, sparkbird. That being the one bird that at some point in their life, either its song or its flight or its color, grabbed a hold of their hearts and wouldn't let go and changed them forever. But it doesn't have to be a bird. It could be anything at all that catches your fancy. It could be at the largest scale, like these large landscape initiatives we're talking about. It could be at the tiniest scale. Doug Tallamy talks about homegrown national parks, meaning taking a tiny strip of your lawn and reintroducing some native plants that bees and butterflies can use as pollinators. There's so many things that are all part of this. That's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be able to join you tonight. And thank you so much for coming and listening. And as I say, remember, there is no empty land. There is just land that is full and can get fuller. And I believe John is joining us for some questions. Thank you very much.
Test. Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much. I'm the John Caledon, the executive director of the Western New York Land Conservancy. And what a privilege it's been to have Tony with us and share his work and his vision with us, really. I feel he's an old friend. We've just met, but his writing and his presentation speak to the deepest values and beliefs that I have in a way that only old friends really can with all of us. But yes, listen, we're going to take some questions from the audience. Kyle will do so, but I first wanted to ask Tony a few questions of my own, okay?
Please. Pull up a stool.
Thank you. You as well. But Tony, first you've talked about the 30-30, which is a goal all of us New Yorkers should feel proud that the state has adopted, as has California. How would you balance our 30 by 30 conservation needs with landowners' interests in their own needs, economic and otherwise, and for example, in commercial developments, including developments that have the tension in them of having that are addressing climate change, yet aren't necessarily compatible with our large and ambitious wildway vision, such as solar panels and windmills?
Well, there's a lot of questions in there, and they're all good ones. Of course, the whole idea for this program is to do it on a voluntary basis. This is not a land grab. This can't be a land grab. This is not an eminent domain matter. It has to be done by people who are interested and willing and eager to do it as they begin to discover reasons why this can be so important to them. Of course, if there was this enormous blue line forest in Western New York, that would draw visitors and begin to be an economic development tool of its own. But as you say, we also have to think about the two great needs of climate change, meeting that and keeping places biodiverse without them bumping into each other. And sometimes solar panels are put on land that has life underneath it, and that makes it hard. Some of the great wind turbines chop up birds that are in flight. We've got to be careful about how we do things. First, we just have to get used to the idea of thinking at this big scale, and that, yes, my piece of property is of great value to me, but it's part of something else too. And maybe it can accommodate my needs and the needs of other people at the same time.
Yes, thank you for that, Tony. In terms of 3030 and New York's leadership role in the movement, what concrete steps should the take, working with land trusts like ours, take to achieve the goal?
Well, New York State is just beginning to think about how to structure this program of 30 by 30. And of course, it is daunting. But if New York State is something like 20% protected, I believe, that means trying to add another 2 to 3 million acres. And land trusts are going to be of immense value there. But I think Western New York has the chance to become a real anchor in a way it never has before, and become something that you have Western New York here, you have the Adirondacks here, you have the Catskills there. Suddenly, people are going to get a different feeling for the whole state and how it all works together. And this is something that I think can be a program that will get people excited and can be a win for the governor. Governors are always looking for wins.
Yes, and it helps that the current governor, of course, is from here.
Yes.
And invested in the area and always interested in what's going on here. But Tony, in terms of we conservationists, there's a quote in your book, and everyone know that this book, the brilliance of this book, and it speaks to, I know will speak to everyone here, but to me, it's now the North Star for how to think about and achieve our work at landscape scale conservation. And so I really want to thank you for that as well, Tony. But how should we conservationists, there's a quote in here about the hard work that conservation is. How should we think about keeping going given the difficulties of conservation work?
Well, I think it was Ben Mackay who said that optimism is oxygen. So just realizing how many people are already hard at work doing wonderful things is invigorating in itself. And thinking of yourselves, or ourselves, all of us, as taking the lead in this is exciting. And the fact that what we do now really might affect life 3,000 years from now, it's sobering, but what a privilege to be alive at that point where it's up to us.
Yes, agree completely, Tony. Can we do it? Can we do it?
Yes, because we are doing it already. And it's taking forms that we didn't know existed before. I mean, it used to be that the question was why, and the answer was, well, because it has to happen. Now we've sort of advanced one step farther, which is how are we going to do it? And again, the answer is why. We don't know exactly how. We're dreaming up new thoughts daily as possibilities arise. But every time you look around and you see someone doing something extraordinary, you realize people are hearing this call. I don't know whether it's the animals talking to them or people stretching out to reach reality. But it's happening. I wish I could have had you all with me as I wandered around the continent, running into all these people, none of whom knew about each other, but all of them doing this extraordinary work.
Yes, thank you. Listen, let's open it up now to the audience. And Kyle's got a microphone as well. And please feel free to ask questions.
Thank you. So I loved all the Benton Mackay references. Fun fact, when Benton Mackay presented his idea for the Appalachian Trail to the Appalachian Mountain Club, he began with a quote from Buffalo's Chauncey Hamlin, who is an early proponent for regional planning. Hey, I had never heard the term spark bird before just now, but in some ways, I think you're my spark bird because 30 years ago in Boston, I heard you speak, and you talked about urbanism and you talked about walkable communities. The first time I'd ever heard about any of those things. And I was just there to find out how to get funding from the new transportation bill for my Greenway project, which I did. But I think there might have been a kind of conversion there because I've been involved in planning and community development work ever since. And so thank you for that. And I guess my question is about greenways. You know, the Transportation Enhancements Program in the Transportation Bill 30 years ago provided some of the first large-scale federal funding for greenway projects. And I'm wondering how, do you think that program sort of met its expectations, and how do you think that the funding for greenways and land conservation may have helped set the stage for what you're talking about now, 30 years later?
Yes, thank you. Lovely question. I think the whole transportation enhancements project did get a good number of good things started. And by building, connecting pathways for people, it did begin to disperse people into the landscape, or rather disperse the landscape into people. There's a new federal transportation project, which is going to be a great help to the critters. And that's the Highway Crossings Act, which is funneling as an initial grant something like $350 million into the whole project of building crossings, animal crossings across busy highways and culverts under them, so that the highways don't act as fences keeping populations of animals apart. And that could be helpful down in the southern part of Western New York, as well as nationally. So again, that seems like the seed program of something new, this time developed for more animal greenways than human greenways, but it's something that is going to be building and of great use, and bringing some, decent scale funding to a big problem for the first time. It's again something the Canadians have pioneered up in Banff National Park. There's a series of crossings of the busy Canadian highway that have now been shown to reunite animal populations in a way that keeps the animal populations from being lessened by the kind of problem that Bill Newmarket identified back in the 80s. Thanks.
Thank you. I noticed on the desired state map of the Western New York greenways that none of them were along the lake. Is there, maybe that's better asked of the Western New York Land Conservancy, but is it because the land is privately owned already?
Can I step in on this?
Please.
Great question. Marisa, are you willing to talk about this? All right. So this is a good opportunity for me to say that Marisa Ricci, our Deputy Executive of Conservation, has really been a chief architect of the Western New York Wildway. Here, she brought it from her work in Vermont, and she is the authority. So I'm going to give her the mic.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So with the mapping of the Wildway that we did, it was really focused on large core habitat. So large in our area, usually forests or wetlands in other areas. And then the connections between those. We had a minimum core size of 4,000 acres because that was tagged at a number of female mammals home range sizes. I'm happy to talk through all of this very in-depthly with anyone who's ever interested. But basically, because we have a lot of development along the lake shores, it's actually quite difficult to find large chunks of natural land that meet that minimum 4,000 acre size. There is one at the Cattaraugus Reservation on Lake Erie. And then we made a tenuous connection up to Lake Ontario, north of the Iroquois National Wildlife and Oak Orchard. But because a lot of those areas also up in like Niagara County and Orleans County are farmlands with smaller patches of forest, you just don't get that bigger core area. Did that answer somewhat? Yes? Okay, great.
Thank you, Marisa.
Other questions, anyone? Several.
We have a couple of questions, I think.
Hi, Tony. First, I just want to say I really enjoyed your book. So I actually yesterday attended a webinar that was about how companies can incorporate biodiversity into their climate strategies, which was really great to see that there are people that are worried about this in large corporations. But they did a poll in the beginning to people to see what was the biggest obstacle that they think of getting this into their climate strategies. And the number one answer, and this is what I said as well, is the issue of getting internal buy-in and investment. So I guess my question to you is, do you have any suggestions for how to get larger companies and corporations to see the value in investing in biodiversity? Because, you know, we can't solve the climate crisis without solving the biodiversity crisis, but corporations might not see that.
Do you mean get them interested in terms of the businesses they're in, or just in terms of working on their own properties?
Well, just in their own climate strategies, and you know, they've got net zero goals and all of these things that they say they're doing. But is there a way that corporations that might not have any direct return on investing in biodiversity, how can we get them, the people with the money, to really care about this?
Well, I think a lot of companies actually are already on the way to that. So many companies now have sustainability officers. And just introducing the whole notion that as they build new plants, they have to think about what's already on the site before they get started. It's just getting underway, but I find there's already interest afoot because so few companies want to be seen as evil. And now we have yet another way of being good. So I think that is a very much a major part of this, but I think it's also something that is beginning to take place. So thanks.
Hi there. Thank you very much, Tony. Quick question for you. What simple things can individuals do right now?
What?
Apartment dwellers, people that live in houses, but you know, people that live in cities, and what can we do as individuals?
There are hundreds of possibilities. What interests you, you know? Whatever it is, other people are thinking about it already and already engaged on it. And it's in your own neighborhood, in the larger community, in the region. Whatever you find exciting is going to be helpful because we're all in this together. And even an apartment dweller's window box can be helpful. So it's just a matter of what you find rewarding, because whatever you find rewarding the planet will reward you, and we are rewarding it. I mean, buildings like this beautiful center, originally a church, came into being to remind people of how amazing the planet is, and that we tread lightly in an amazing living world. We can bring that awareness into our own lives, even outside beautiful buildings like that. And the more we do to participate in what's has to be done, the easier it will be.
Ms. Kyle, I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Hello. First of all, it was a great talk, by the way. Okay. One of the things I find really interesting is I've been a birder now for like the last 5 years, and I can bump into people in places like Forest Lawn And I'll say, hey, you look at these birds here, and they cannot believe, they're shocked at the amount of color in the wild, even in places like that. And these are people that are walking through there. I'm wondering, and this is for everybody in the whole audience, I wonder if we should start having a push, just like they're doing with American history. Start having programs or start having some kind of an idea in the junior high schools in New York State that says, look, this is what's here. This is how fascinating it is. Because if they don't know, they don't know what they're missing. And then all of a sudden they're in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s. Well, you might have had 20 or 30 years of somebody that might have cared even more if they found out that something's out there.
Well, I think you're onto something. I think this is something they would love to hear more about, and I'm sure some of the outreach programs of the Conservancy are working along those lines. Yes. Got to get started.
So we have one more question here. Looks like we have a couple more, but we'll have to do one more here, and then you can ask Tony when you're purchasing his book or when you're getting his book signed.
I do hope you will come and buy the book too. Yes. I'll be delighted to inscribe it.
Tony, I'd like to say thank you for coming to Western New York and seeing what we have to offer. It is a little disturbing what this gentleman said about the younger generation not showing and being present to hear what we have and what can be and what we can lose if we're not careful. We're in a position where we were fortunate enough to find a piece of land that was next to Tonawanda Management Preserve. We didn't know what we were getting into until we walked the property and then explored it further, finding blue spotted salamanders and turtles and beavers, wood ducks, everything. And that could have been developed by a developer, and we prevented that. And I think it's our generation who has the wherewithal to maybe step up and try, like you say, no land is empty, and try to get people, developers particularly, to consider preserving the habitat that's around them, because the wildlife is suffering. And we lose wildlife. They say nature, wildlife, everything heals, especially us, because of the trauma and what we see. So I think it's up to us, our generation, to help the younger generation understand that, starting in the schools like that gentleman said, but also get them to participate more on a hands-on basis with smaller projects in nature. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing me to Western New York. As John said, I feel like we're old friends already.
Yes.
After a couple of days, because so much is happening here. It's just very exciting to be among you.
Yes, thank you, Tony. We can't thank you enough for sharing your experience and wisdom with us. And thank you all for coming. It's a privilege to have you all here with us and to hearing your ideas as well. I mean, we're a community that's going to take these wonderful ideas and share them with the world, okay, and change the world as a result. Please do stay and talk to Tony afterwards and pick up the book. As I said, for me, it's a new North Star, and I'm sure you'll agree with me. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, John.